Greetings, friend, and welcome to the Between the Covers podcast, where we are working every day to remove the self limiting beliefs that are preventing us from becoming the heroes of our own stories. I am Marcus Spar, and today I want to talk about adverse experiences. In my role as a recovery coach, I have heard from many different sources about ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. I was also listening to a podcast earlier today talking about adverse religious experiences. And I do just want to shout out Dr. Laura Anderson and Andrew Curbs from the Sunday School Dropouts podcast for opening my eyes to this. Well, I guess not really opening my eyes. I'm well aware of adverse religious experiences in my life, but they are also doing some good work in trying to study what the impacts of adverse religious experiences are, and even coining that term of adverse religious experiences. And it got me thinking because it seems that a week doesn't go by where I'm not reminded of ACEs. And I'm having conversations with clients, and we often talk about, well, when you're having these thoughts and these beliefs, these feelings coming up, do they remind you of anything from your past? Because our past is very much present in the decisions and the behaviors that we have on a daily basis. If you're not familiar with adverse childhood experiences, there are 10 of them that have been recognized, and are broken into they are broken down into three different groupings, and they mention household challenges. So under household challenges, you have domestic violence, you have substance use, you have mental illness, you have parental separation or divorce, and you have incarceration. The next grouping is abuse, and they mention emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And then neglect, they mention emotional neglect and physical neglect. And since they're still trying to do some research on adverse religious experiences at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, they they didn't really mention like any specific groups or examples of adverse religious experiences, but they do generalize them in coercion. They mentioned Darvo. When I was listening to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast, they didn't mention any specific examples per se as like spirit, or I guess spiritual abuse would be one, but like physical abuse, emotional abuse, incarceration, those kinds of examples. But they did mention some examples of coercion and blame shifting and gaslighting, which I imagine would be recognized examples of adverse religious experiences. And the reason why I want to talk about just these adverse experiences in general is because we all have them. We all have adverse experiences in our lives. I have not been shy about sharing many of the adverse experiences I had growing up, from bullying, from not being accepted, from even being ostracized from groups, and having to navigate divorce, having to navigate loneliness, the separation between me and my twin brother, and of course, the religious experiences I've had from high controlled religion. These are all things that have happened to me, and they have had an impact on who I am, on how I think, and oftentimes how I respond to certain situations. And the reason why this is important is because since this is something that everyone has, because let's face it, no one goes through life without having some kind of adverse experiences. This is important to talk about because it might give some clarity in why you may act the way that you do, why you have certain thought patterns and beliefs about yourself and about the world around you. And I also feel it is important to specify here that just because you have adverse experiences in your life doesn't mean that you have trauma. In fact, I have heard this from many different sources in terms of ACEs that the more you have experienced with these 10 examples of adverse childhood experiences, the more likely you are to have some kind of trauma pattern in your life. And the same thing was said with Andrew Curbs and Dr. Laura Anderson on the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. You can have someone who experiences one of these adverse religious experiences and they have trauma. You can have someone who experiences hundreds of examples of adverse religious experiences and they don't have any trauma. When we're talking about something as diverse as the human experience, there's no clean cut way of saying, yep, because this happened, it's something that's traumatizing. And I'll use myself as an example here because I know many, many people have had very similar experiences to me, as my dad saying that I was as worthless as tits on a board when I was about 7 or 8 years old. That was something that had quite the impact on me. And it was something I didn't realize that impact until I was much older and I had to work through some of my perfectionistic behaviors and the mindset I had of trying to do things perfectly the first time, even if I'm inexperienced. But some people have heard that same thing from a beloved family member and they can just shrug it off. Just because you've had adverse experiences does not mean that you have some kind of trauma that needs to be processed. However, if you do have trauma that needs to be processed, there is a good chance that there are some adverse experiences, typically from your childhood, but not necessarily from your childhood, that need to be worked through. The reason why I want to specify that is some of my experiences within high control religion, yeah, they span from when I was a child, but some of the glaring examples of how I was being used and abused and coerced into doing things for free and taking on a lot of responsibility within, especially my previous church, those are very recent. And those are not tied to necessarily experiences I had as a child. Granted, I was taught the value of volunteering and giving my time to the church. So, adverse experiences are something that we all have. If you have some kind of unwanted behavior in your life, if you have a habit of lashing out at people when things aren't going well, especially those that you love, if you have a habit of shutting down when things start to get difficult, if you find yourself binge eating when you're at points of stress, or maybe you turn to alcohol or some other kind of substance to help regulate you when you're feeling stress, when you're feeling fear, when you're feeling overwhelmed. It is possible that there is some kind of adverse experience that has guided you to this coping mechanism. And I talk about coping mechanisms a lot on this channel. We all have them. I don't know of anyone who doesn't have a coping mechanism, whether it's something like work, if it's exercising, if it's trying to maintain some kind of body image, if it's turning to video games or movies or scrolling on social media, if it's just getting lost in your YouTube feed or just moving from one short to the next, turning to alcohol, if it's even something like cutting and self harm. These are all coping mechanisms. And a lot of times, these coping mechanisms were developed to help us overcome some kind of adverse experience in our lives. So if you find yourself with some of these problematic behaviors that you don't want to have in your life anymore, it's not a matter of getting rid of these behaviors. In fact, I often say when I'm talking about my unhealthy relationship that I had with my own sexuality and my pornography use when I was younger, well, it was a solution to a much deeper problem. But whenever I would do anything to try and work on this behavior, I was typically met with, well, just stop doing it. The behavior is the problem. The using pornography is the problem. The sitting down and playing video games for hours on end is the problem. No, they were doing a great job of helping me to run away from what I was truly afraid of and what was causing me the pain. This would be a lack of acceptance. This would be coming from a broken home. This would be feeling like I was alone and I didn't belong anywhere. Those were feelings I really didn't want to feel. They were very difficult feelings. And in my experience in the Christian church, I was often taught not to trust my feelings, not to trust my body. I couldn't even identify some of these feelings that I was having. I legit was just running away from all of these very difficult feelings and experiences that I had. And I was doing that through escapism with pornography, with video games. And as I got older, sometimes that escapism came through alcohol. I learned it through food at a very young age. I don't have my physique that I have today because I didn't use food as a means to cope with what was going on in life. I want to challenge you, my friend, as we discuss this. When you are looking at any kind of behavior in your life that you want to change, anything that is preventing you from stepping into being the hero in your own story, there is a reason for it. And it likely stems from an adverse experience from when you were younger. And that's what needs to be healed. It's not just a matter of positive mental attitude. It's not just saying to yourself that, no, that's not true. It's definitely an aspect of cognitive behavioral therapy is you challenge those thoughts, but sometimes you need a little more. Sometimes you just need to feel the feelings. Sometimes you just need to be able to identify them. Sometimes it might be having someone there to help you discover the language of what was going on. I think about a client that I used to work with who was having a really difficult time with his partner who was going through some a difficult depression season, and he was constantly in fear that he would come home and she would have ended her life. And while we were talking this one time and he was sharing that with me, I kind of stopped and I said, okay, how does that make you feel? And he kind of paused for a moment and was like, I hadn't really stopped to consider that. And he was expressing what the feelings were that were coming up for him. He was feeling afraid. He was angry whenever this depression would come up. He felt like things were out of control in his life. And as we were discussing, I said, how is something like that not traumatizing? The mere, the sheer thought of coming home and expecting to see the person that you are committed to, the person that you love, having ended their life. Whether that happens or not, that has an impact on our nervous system. That can be traumatizing. And after he considered that, he's like, wow, I never thought of it that way. And it gave him a different perspective to look at these experiences, these very recent and real experiences when we were having this conversation. Really, what I want to do is I just want to normalize what we are all going through right now. I have shared, I believe, on a previous episode that Libby and we've already had two different scares that we were going to lose our health insurance just because of what is happening at the White House and the changes that are being made in the government. We were beginning to wonder if we would even be able to afford health insurance. And trust me, for two people who do rely on medications to help keep ourselves balanced, it's important to make sure that we have the means to afford this. I even had my own experience of walking around my own house, wondering how the mental health of my partner was and whether she was having any thoughts of suicide. I started having thoughts of suicide myself. Things can be and often are very challenging for us. And if we don't have the means to cope with these experiences, with these decisions, with these challenges in life, then it's going to leave an impact. And we will often turn to some kind of means of coping. So the coping is not the problem. There's usually something much deeper beneath the surface that needs to be addressed. And if this is something that you would like some help with, you can get in touch with me and see if there is a way that I can help you. I would love to help however I can, whether it's just creating space for you to just vent and get out whatever you're thinking and just create that safety for you to voice what's on your heart and your mind without there being any kind of judgment. I have asked some clients in the past when we start having a conversation, it's like, well, what is it that you need right now? And they're like, I just kind of need this space. I just need to have the time where I can just talk about all of this stuff that's going on. Sometimes it might be something where there's more advice. Hey, what do you think about this? What are some things that you think could be helpful? What are some things I could try out? And I'm happy to workshop any of that if that's something that you think would be beneficial. Ultimately, the solution for how to overcome any adverse experiences, it's not clear cut. There's no cookie cutter option. I don't know why I want to go with these options of clear cutting, cookie cutting, and that's just where my mind's going right now. Apparently, I really want a cookie right now. But the solution is typically going to need to be tailored to you and your unique experiences. And just know you don't have to go through this alone. You do not have to try and figure this out all by yourself. There's no reason for you to have to remake, or not remake, to redo. I don't know what I'm trying to say here. There is no reason for you to reinvent the wheel here. There are a lot of people who have gone through this before and are eager and happy to help, myself being one of those. Don't try and work on this stuff by yourself. Have someone there who can offer you compassion and empathy and be able to create a safe space for you to process what's going on and help you come back to reality when these experiences become so large and overwhelming that they threaten to just take over and you go back to your coping mechanism. I am here to help. There are many people that are here to help. Please don't try and go through this alone. It can oftentimes make matters worse. I mean, let's face it, working with a therapist can sometimes make matters worse. That's why whenever I hear people talking about therapy, it's so important to mention you got to find the right therapist. You got to find the right person who can help. But just know there is a reason why you're doing what you're doing. There's adverse experiences in your childhood or even much more recently that are driving these behaviors within you that are contributing to how you feel about yourself and your life and the world around you. If you're not happy with how those feelings are, there's no reason for you to just stay here where you are. You can move forward. You can find help. And so I encourage you, my friend, to do just that, to find some help. I hope this has helped to lift up the rock a little bit of some things that may be hiding within your experience and in your story. If you want to become the hero of your story, you will need to own up to the things that have happened to you, and you'll need to speak the truth about it. And that can be challenging, but it's so worth it. It's so worth it to start walking in that strength instead of being hindered by many things that weren't even your choice or your responsibility. So hang in there, keep doing the hard work, and until next time, live strong for today.